Welcome to EduCasts, home of EduCasters. For centuries, education was largely a one-way street, the sage on the stage pouring information into the empty vessels of the students. This model, often called direct instruction, certainly has its place, but it frequently overlooks the fundamental human drive for curiosity, agency, and self-direction. The discovery learning theory flips this script entirely, asserting that deep, enduring understanding doesn't come from being told something, but from figuring it out for yourself. It is the architectural blueprint for an educational environment where students construct knowledge actively, reorganizing and transforming information to arrive at new insights, often referred to as the coveted aha moment. Discovery learning, DL, is not a single rigid methodology, but rather an overarching philosophy rooted in constructivism. It is defined by the principle that students should interact with their environment and manipulate objects, concepts, or ideas to discover facts, relationships, and new truths for themselves. While its conceptual roots stretch back to antiquity, it gained full academic gravity in the mid-20th century. Championed most famously by the American psychologist Jerome Bruner, he argued passionately that the goal of education was not to cover content, but to develop the intellectual potency of the learner, to teach students to think like a scientist, historian, or artist, even if they were only in the 4th grade. This approach promises not just better memory, but better transferability of knowledge, equipping students with a mental toolkit ready for the real-world problems that lie ahead. However, its implementation is far from a simple free-for-all. It demands meticulous planning, expert scaffolding, and a deep understanding of the cognitive processes involved. To truly grasp the complexity and enduring relevance of DL, one must trace its philosophical genealogy, dissect Bruner's powerful psychological framework, examine the practical methods of implementation, weigh its proven benefits against persistent critiques, and finally, look at how the theory is being refined for the modern educational landscape. We will take a deep dive into each of these facets, aiming to provide a comprehensive look at one of the most influential and debated ideas in modern pedagogy. The philosophical and historical roots. The idea that active involvement is crucial for learning is hardly new. Discovery learning, as theorized by Bruner, stands on the shoulders of giants whose work often ran counter to the rote memorization that dominated schooling for generations. To understand DL, we have to recognize these foundational voices who paved the way for the ultimate constructionist movement. Precursors in antiquity and the Enlightenment. The intellectual lineage of discovery can be traced back to the Socratic method, or maieutic. Socrates didn't lecture. He used persistent, probing questioning to help his interlocutors discover knowledge that was supposedly already latent within them. He acted as an intellectual midwife, assisting in the birth of ideas. This technique, though primarily philosophical, established the precedent of the teacher as a facilitator rather than a mere broadcaster of facts. Centuries later, during the Enlightenment, thinkers challenged the punitive, authoritarian nature of traditional schooling. Jean-Jacques Rousseau, in his treatise Emile or On Education, 1762, argued for an education focused on a child's natural interests and capacities, allowing the child to learn through natural consequences and exploration. The child, in Rousseau's view, should be allowed to discover, not compelled to memorize. Following this path, the Swiss reformer Johann Heinrich Pestalozzi championed head, heart, and hands education, insisting that learning must start with concrete observation and sensory experience. He developed the idea of Anschauung, learning through direct observation and the senses, which is a crucial step in the process of personal knowledge construction. The pragmatism of John Dewey. The single most influential American precursor to Bruner's work was John Dewey, 1859 to 1952. Dewey's philosophy of pragmatism asserted that education should be an active process of learning by doing. For Dewey, schools were not preparation for life. They were life itself, a miniature society where students engaged in authentic problems and collaborative inquiry. Dewey was deeply critical of the idea that knowledge could be neatly packaged and delivered. He believed that the mind is a dynamic instrument used to adapt to and reshape the environment. Therefore, true learning happens when a student encounters a difficulty, a problem, frames a hypothesis, tests it, and then evaluates the results. This process of reflective thought, identifying a problem and systematically working towards a solution, is the essence of discovery. Dewey's insistence on experiential education and the use of the scientific method in all subjects fundamentally set the stage for Bruner's formalization of discovery learning. Gestalt psychology and the structure of knowledge. While Dewey provided the philosophical backbone, the psychological mechanics of DL found support in the early 20th century movement of Gestalt psychology. Gestalt psychologists like Wolfgang Kohler studied how organisms solve problems through insight. Kohler's famous experiments with chimpanzees showed that learning wasn't always a gradual process of trial and error, as B.F. Skinner and behaviorists argued, but often an abrupt, comprehensive understanding, the sudden realization of a solution by seeing the relationship between parts and the whole. This insight is the cognitive twin of the aha moment in discovery learning. Gestalt theory emphasized that the learner structures their perception of the world into meaningful wholes, gestalts. Discovery, then, is the act of perceiving a previously unseen structure or pattern in a set of seemingly disparate facts. This focus on structure and pattern recognition would become the central pillar of Bruner's theoretical framework, as we explore in the next section. The theoretical core. Jerome Bruner's model. Jerome Bruner, 1915 to 2016, is the towering figure associated with discovery learning. His work, particularly his landmark, 1960 book, The Process of Education, synthesized the progressive ideals of Dewey and the cognitive insights of Gestalt psychology into a coherent theory designed to reform American schooling. The context and the challenge. Bruner's ideas blossomed during the post-Sputnik era, a time when American education was under immense scrutiny, fearing that it was lagging behind global scientific advancements. The challenge was clear. How could education foster creative, critical thinkers capable of tackling complex, novel problems? Bruner's answer was DL, arguing that simply memorizing answers to old problems would never suffice. He proposed that the very structure of disciplines, mathematics, physics, history, was discoverable, and that students needed to learn the how-to of knowledge creation. Key principles of discovery learning. Bruner articulated 4 main themes for an effective education, all tightly interwoven with the discovery process. 1. The structure of knowledge. Bruner contended that every subject has a fundamental underlying structure, a set of essential ideas, relationships, and principles that organize the entire discipline. Teaching effectively, he argued, means teaching this structure, not just a barrage of isolated facts. For example, a historian doesn't just memorize dates. They look for patterns of causality, power shifts, and recurring human motivations. A physicist doesn't just memorize formulas. They understand the core relationship between force, mass, and acceleration. When a student is allowed to discover the structure, the details become easier to hold on to because they have a framework, a cognitive hook, to hang the information on. This is what gives knowledge its transfer power. If you learn the structure of argumentation in a debate, you can apply it to a legal case, a business pitch, or a family discussion. 2. Readiness for learning, the spiral curriculum. Perhaps Bruner's most famous contribution is the concept of the spiral curriculum. This principle directly addressed the myth that complex ideas must be taught only at an advanced age. Bruner famously stated, any subject can be taught effectively in some intellectually honest form to any child at any stage of development. The spiral curriculum involves introducing fundamental concepts early on, simply and intuitively, and then revisiting them repeatedly over the years at increasing levels of complexity and abstraction. Each iteration builds upon the last, reinforcing the core structure while demanding deeper understanding. Iteration 1, elementary. A child discovers the concept of energy by observing a ball rolling down a ramp. Iteration 2, middle school. the student revisits the concept, learning the formulas for potential and kinetic energy. Iteration 3, high school. The student studies thermodynamics and the conservation of energy, applying the core principle to complex systems. This spiraling approach ensures the learner is always ready to discover the next layer of complexity because they have already established the foundational framework. The process of discovery is thus continuous and cumulative. 3. The role of intuition and hypothesis testing. Discovery is inherently messy. It requires the learner to take intellectual risks, make educated guesses, and tolerate uncertainty, a process Bruner called intuition. Intuition is not guessing blindly, but the mental process of arriving at a plausible solution or relationship before being able to formally prove it. Discovery learning encourages students to formulate hypotheses. Example, I bet heavier objects fall faster, and then test those hypotheses through experimentation or inquiry. The learning doesn't just come from the correct answer, but from the process of setting up the test and analyzing the results, especially when the results are contrary to the initial guess. This focus on the process of scientific inquiry is what develops intellectual potency. 4. Intrinsic motivation. The greatest reward for discovery, Bruner argued, is not a gold star or a good grade, but the intrinsic satisfaction of having solved the problem. This is the joy of the aha moment. When students discover a principle for themselves, the feeling of intellectual ownership is potent. This internal reward system fuels further exploration, transforming the student from a passive recipient of knowledge into a self-propelled, lifelong learner. The act of discovery defined. Bruner defined the act of discovery as a matter of rearranging or transforming evidence in such a way that one is enabled to go beyond the evidence so reassembled to new insights. This is a critical distinction. Discovery learning is not about finding something that was literally hidden, but about creating new knowledge through the reorganization of existing knowledge. The student takes familiar facts, rotates them in their mind, applies a new lens, and generates a new understanding, a true moment of intellectual creation.